Australians have given their verdict on the government's actions to address climate change, and it's one of the few issues on which people on both sides of the political divide agree.
We asked tens of thousands of Australians for their views on climate change. Well, Casey Briggs has the latest results from the ABC's Australia Talks national survey.
74%. That's the percentage of Australians that say the federal government is doing a bad job addressing climate change. Only 23% say the government's on the right track. A majority say the same in all age groups and income groups. But what about political groups? 99% of Greens voters say the government's doing a bad job curtailing carbon, along with 96% of Labor voters. And a majority of coalition voters as well. 55% say the government is doing a bad job on this issue. The only voter group that's more inclined to give the federal government a thumbs up on climate change is One Nation voters. So what would voters change? Well, across the board, an even stronger majority, 81% of us say the federal government needs to be doing more to tackle climate change. Most of those say much more is needed. We overwhelmingly think more of our energy should come from renewable sources. 3/4 of us think combating climate change will require people around the world to drastically change their lifestyles. And we tend to disagree that new technologies are on the way to solve climate change without making those lifestyle changes. But there is one question on which we're more divided. It's often the sticking point in political debates about climate. Efforts to combat climate change should not come at the expense of Australian jobs. 46% agree jobs need to be maintained. 38% disagree. And the strongest agreement on this question is in Queensland. Notwithstanding that, on the whole, climate change was one of a handful of issues in the Australia Talks survey that saw emphatic agreement that we're not doing enough.
Casey Briggs there. Well, here to explain what the numbers actually mean is Professor Jacqueline Peel, who is the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne. Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for taking the time to speak with us this morning. It's interesting, isn't it? The numbers are in, and generally there is an agreement that climate change is affecting our lives across Australia and that something must be done. But are Australians willing to experience some discomfort, either through their lifestyle or through the purse strings, to see a change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the figures are incredibly strong that Australians care about climate change, that they're seeing that it is impacting their lives, and that they feel that the federal government in particular is not doing enough to address it. Of course, people are worried about how that affects their jobs and their futures, particularly as we transition away from a fossil fuel economy. So it points to the fact that there's really a need to make sure that people understand how that transition will occur and that it's occurring in a fair way that ensures that there are good and decent jobs for people to transition into.
Let's talk about that transition. You mentioned there. Now, 46% believe that efforts to combat climate change should not come at the expense of Australian jobs. Fair enough. We're all concerned about our jobs. We're concerned about our future generations as well. Well, how much is that tied to the fact that there needs to be a better message when it comes to transitioning from fossil fuel industries to greener economies?
Yeah, look, this is a really important part of the story of addressing climate change, and we're really beginning to see a focus on that message internationally from leaders like Joe Biden, the President of the United States, and increasingly also from our own government. That's really changed the messaging to focus on the opportunities around a clean, green economy. Our Prime Minister tends to talk about a low emissions economy, which can involve still quite a significant role for fossil fuels. But you're right that there's a really important messaging piece of this to tell people that climate change is a problem. It probably does require massive changes in our economy that have to happen quite rapidly, but that also needs to occur in a way that people feel that they can manage that change. At the moment, we're all experiencing massive change with the COVID crisis. I think it shows us that we can respond very effectively to change over a short period of time. We need to be thinking about how we learn the lessons of that for dealing with climate change as well.
So are you saying then that if there was a solid jobs transition plan going forward, that 46% of Australians who say that changes to climate change it shouldn't come at the expense of Australian jobs, that number would decrease?
Well, one can never predict that kind of thing in a survey, but certainly what we've seen overseas in countries like Germany, for example, where they've had a really strong focus on what's called just transition, or ensuring that there is a narrative around how we're going to manage the transition away from coal and fossil fuels and put people into new kinds of jobs. Where you've had that kind of really dedicated program, you've seen much greater uptake by the community, including in coal communities, of the idea that there needs to be change to address climate change. In the Latrobe Valley in Gippsland at the moment, we're seeing how climate change and extreme weather events can affect not just people's houses and so on, but also the operation of coal-fired power plants. This is a technology that's increasingly going to come under threat. There's a recognition that we need to change, but people understandably want to know what the pathway is and how it will affect them and their families.
Jacqueline, the government also came in under criticism in this survey. 65% thought that the federal government should be doing more to tackle climate change. When you compare Australia's efforts and plans going forward, how does that compare to the UK, the US and other countries on the global scale?
Yeah, look, the comparison is pretty poor at the moment, and you can see that just in the figures. So our target for reducing emissions to 2030 is half of what, for example, the US is putting forward. It's even less than what the UK is putting forward. So most of the other countries that we would regard as international peers are really pushing forward with strong targets. Our 2030 emissions target is the same one that we've had since 2013, the Abbott era. So we're lagging behind. There's a real transition that's going ahead internationally, and we're at the back of the pack.
Okay, so the UK, US, China promising major cuts to emissions by 2050. But really, how realistic are these changes?
Well, all of those countries are not just promising targets by 2050, but they're also putting in place interim targets. So, for example, the UK putting in place a target to 2030 and 2050. These kind of targets provide a pathway and a signal for business and the community about the changes that are needed. That's why they're quite important to have in place. Otherwise, it's a little bit like we're working without an action plan, and we don't really know what direction to take the economy. So you see, for example, in Australia, businesses coming out quite strongly in favour of the Australian government announcing a net zero by 2050 target and more clarity on interim reduction targets, because they can see what's happening at the international level. They know the economy is transitioning, and they want to make sure Australia's not left behind.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your time this morning. Professor Jacqueline Peel there, the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures at the University of Melbourne.
Thanks for having me.